The steam rising from the industrial dishwasher fogged up the already humid air in the back of the bustling restaurant. Plates clattered. Pots slammed. The sour scent of leftover gravy, burnt cheese, and bleach hung in the air like a cloud of exhaustion. Among the chaos stood a young man, barely 20, his uniform soaked, fingers pruned, and eyes red from lack of sleep. His name was Luis Alvarez. No one noticed him. No one thanked him. He was invisible. But today, someone was watching. Garrett Stone, the 58-year-old CEO of the multi-million-dollar restaurant chain, Flamehouse Grills, had made a decision 2 weeks ago that would change his life, and the life of one dishwasher, forever. Tired of boardroom reports and polished presentations, Garrett wanted to see his empire through the eyes of the people who kept it running. He shaved his beard, dyed his graying hair black, and put on the cheap uniform of a new kitchen trainee. No one recognized him, not even the regional manager. He had worked in 3 different locations over the past month. But something about the Riverdale branch felt off. The employees smiled too wide in front of management and too little when they thought no one was watching. There was a stiffness in the air that Garrett couldn't quite place. That's when he noticed Luis. Luis didn't speak much. He rarely looked anyone in the eye. He came in at 9 a.m. and stayed until midnight. Every day. No complaints. No breaks. When Garrett casually asked about him, a shift supervisor muttered, "He's a hard worker, poor guy. But he's, not technically on the payroll." That made Garrett pause. "What do you mean he's not on payroll?" The supervisor quickly backtracked. "He's training, I think. Waiting for papers to go through. He'll get paid soon." But Garrett knew that was a lie. He'd heard similar excuses before from shady franchise operators who pocketed labor hours from undocumented workers. That night, Garrett stayed behind to clean up while most of the crew went home. Luis was still scrubbing trays, his eyes barely staying open. Garrett struck up a quiet conversation. It took a while, but eventually, Luis opened up. "I was told I'd get paid in 2 weeks, it's been 5 months, Luis said softly, his voice hoarse. "But I can't leave. My little sister has epilepsy. Her medicine, it's expensive. My mom's gone. My dad, he drinks. If I don't work, she doesn't get her meds." Garrett's throat tightened. "So you've been working here, for free?" Luis hesitated, then nodded. "I sleep in the supply closet. I eat leftovers. It's not much, but I keep telling myself, at least she's safe." Garrett didn't sleep that night. He stayed up in a cheap motel, going through the internal records of the restaurant's payroll. Luis's name was nowhere. But profits for the Riverdale branch were unusually high, especially for a location in a struggling neighborhood. He dug deeper. The franchise owner, Martin Keller, had submitted false labor logs, pocketing wages that should have gone to workers like Luis. Garrett's blood boiled. But he didn't react immediately. He kept showing up for his shifts. He observed. He listened. He saw how Keller bullied other workers into silence. How threats of immigration checks kept undocumented workers in line. How the general manager looked the other way for a little extra bonus. Then Garrett made his move. On the last Saturday of the month, he called a mandatory all-staff meeting. The employees shuffled in, expecting another boring training video. But instead, they saw Garrett walk in. This time in a full tailored suit, flanked by lawyers and corporate investigators. "I'm not a trainee," Garrett announced calmly. "I'm Garrett Stone, CEO of Flamehouse Grills. And I'm here because of one of you." Whispers turned to gasps. Some employees looked terrified. Others relieved. Garrett's eyes locked with Luis, who looked confused, scared, and suddenly very small in the corner of the room. I met a young man who's been working double shifts without a paycheck, Garrett continued. Sleeping on the floor. Feeding himself from scraps. And all while caring for a sick sister. That ends today. The room went silent. I want everyone here to know, what happened in this location was not just unethical, it was criminal. And we're going to fix it. Starting now. Garrett walked over to Luis and handed him a check. It was for 5 months' worth of wages, including overtime. But that wasn't all. You're also getting a full scholarship for your sister's medical care. And if you want it, a permanent role in our corporate training program. You don't belong in a closet, Luis. You belong in the light. Luis broke down. Tears streamed down his face as the room erupted in applause. Some employees cried. Others hugged him. But Garrett wasn't done yet. He turned to the rest of the staff. If you've ever been unpaid, underpaid, or threatened into silence, I want you to come forward. You will be protected. Over the next week, 14 employees came forward with similar stories. Garrett didn't just fire the corrupt manager, he pressed charges. Keller was arrested. The restaurant was shut down for a week and reopened under new leadership. Garrett personally oversaw the transformation. But the most beautiful change of all came from Luis. A year later, he stood on a stage at a company-wide summit, now wearing a Flamehouse corporate badge. I was just a dishwasher, he said into the microphone, voice steady. But someone believed in me. That belief changed my life. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. Garrett knew this issue wasn't isolated to Riverdale. After the scandal broke, dozens of emails started pouring into his office. Stories of abuse, threats, unpaid overtime, discrimination, and more. Some came from within his own restaurants. Others from former employees who had long given up hope. That night, Garrett sat alone in his office, reading each one. There was Rosa in Arizona, who had her hours stolen by a manager who clocked her out early, then forced her to keep working. There was Jamal in Chicago, who hadn't seen a raise in 5 years, despite being the first to arrive and last to leave. There was Mei Ling in San Diego, who had to bring her toddler into the break room because she couldn't afford childcare, and was threatened with termination for it. Garrett leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed but resolute. This is bigger than one restaurant, he murmured. This is about who we are. The next morning, he gathered his top leadership and made a bold declaration. They would launch a nationwide employee audit. Every franchise would be reviewed. Every complaint investigated. Every employee interviewed anonymously and directly. Any location found exploiting workers would be immediately removed from the Flamehouse network. And it didn't stop there. Garrett introduced what he called the Invisible Voices Initiative. Every Flamehouse location was now required to hold monthly roundtables where even the lowest-ranked employee could speak openly without fear of retaliation. A new fund was set up to support emergency aid for employees in crisis, whether medical, housing, or legal. Luis was made the spokesperson. He visited cities, shared his story, sat in on roundtables, and helped design policies from an employee's perspective. Managers listened to him. Executives respected him. Workers trusted him, because he had walked in their shoes. But not everyone was happy. Some franchise owners pushed back. They didn't like the scrutiny. They didn't like being told to open their books. They said it was bad for profits. Garrett stood firm. If treating workers like human beings is bad for profits, he told them, then maybe your version of business isn't worth saving. Several locations were stripped of their Flamehouse branding. New owners were brought in. Garrett's legal team worked overtime to ensure employees got back pay where possible. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One night, after a long tour of locations, Garrett and Luis sat in a quiet hotel bar. "You're changing things," Garrett said. Luis shook his head. You are. No, Garrett replied. I just finally saw what was always there. It took your courage to bring it into the light. They toasted, not to profits, or expansions, or awards, but to dignity. Meanwhile, back in Riverdale, the old restaurant had become a symbol of hope. Employees there now worked fair hours, got proper training, and were offered health coverage. Louise visited often, checking in on the new dishwasher. Her name was Amina. She was 19. And she was saving for college. He handed her a small envelope once, smiling. Scholarship from the Invisible Voices Fund, he said. Someone believed in me once. Now it's your turn. Amina teared up and hugged him tightly. And for the first time, Louise truly felt the weight of what Garrett meant when he said, "You belong in the light." Because now, he was the one helping others step into it. The train rattled gently as Louise stared out the window, watching the blurred shapes of buildings and graffiti-stained walls rush by. It had been 2 years since he first walked into the back door of that flamehouse kitchen, desperate, tired, and invisible. Now, he was heading to Washington, D.C., not for vacation, but to testify before the Senate Labor Committee on fair wage legislation. He still couldn't believe it. A former dishwasher, standing before lawmakers, speaking not just for himself, but for the thousands like him who had no voice. Garrett had arranged everything, coached him through every question, helped him build confidence, and insisted that no one else could tell the story like he could. You lived it, Garrett had told him before he boarded the train. That matters more than 100 suits quoting spreadsheets. Louise carried more than notes that day. He carried memories. He remembered the night his mother collapsed in their one-bedroom apartment in El Paso. The ambulance came too late. She died of an untreated heart condition. Louise was 16. Sophia was 10. There was no insurance, no savings. Just bills. He dropped out of school and took 2 jobs, fast food in the morning, cleaning offices at night. His father came and went, drunk or angry. So Louise became both brother and parent. When Sophia had her first seizure, he was the only one who stayed calm enough to hold her, cry quietly, and still call 911. He remembered being cheated at work. Cleaning bathrooms at midnight and getting paid half what was promised. You're undocumented, one employer sneered. You think you can complain? He remembered the fear. The shame. The silence. But now, he had a platform. And he wasn't staying silent. In the grand hall of the Senate building, Louise stood behind a wooden podium. Cameras clicked. Reporters typed quickly. The room was full of senators, activists, and business leaders. My name is Luis Alvarez, he began, voice steady. I'm not an economist. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a politician. I'm just someone who washed dishes in the back of a restaurant where nobody looked me in the eye. He told them everything, how he worked unpaid for 5 months. How he slept in a closet. How fear of deportation was used to silence him. And how one man, Garrett Stone, chose to care. Most CEOs sit in corner offices and forget the names of the people who clean their floors. Garrett came to us. He walked into the kitchen, put on a uniform, and earned our trust. And because of that, I'm here. He looked directly at the senators. If we want change, it starts with accountability. No more loopholes. No more excuses. Pay people fairly. Protect their dignity. If you don't, someone always profits, and someone always suffers. When he finished, the room stood in applause. Even the most hardened politicians were moved. A week later, national networks picked up the story, from dishwasher to advocate, Luis Alvarez moves Congress to action. Garrett watched from his office, pride swelling in his chest. He didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the ripple. The wave. The spark that Louise had become for thousands. Soon, Flame House's Invisible Voices initiative expanded into a full-blown movement. Other chains followed suit, establishing whistleblower protection policies, fair wage audits, and anonymous complaint lines. Worker unions began citing the Flame House model in negotiation meetings. Labor rights groups asked Luis to speak at events. He even gave a TED Talk titled, "The Cost of Silence." But with recognition came backlash. Some industry giants accused Garrett of overcorrecting and crippling franchise flexibility. Profits in certain locations dropped due to added wage compliance. Stockholders raised eyebrows. Garrett called a meeting. "Let me be clear," he said to the board. "This company will succeed with integrity, or not at all. If short-term profit requires long-term cruelty, we're in the wrong business." There was silence in the room. Then, slowly, a few board members nodded. Garrett had built Flame House with grit, and he wasn't afraid to burn it down if it meant rebuilding it right. Meanwhile, Luis's personal life was healing, too. Sophia was now 14 and thriving in school. She hadn't had a seizure in almost a year. Thanks to consistent treatment and care, she was healthier than ever. Garrett had set up a trust fund for her education, and Luis was now earning enough to move them out of the one-bedroom apartment into a modest house in a safe neighborhood. One evening, as they unpacked boxes into their new home, Sophia handed Luis a small envelope. It was a letter she'd written in school. "Dear Big Brother," it read, "I know you're tired. I see your eyes every night when you think I'm sleeping. I see how you still look over your shoulder like someone's going to take it all away. But I want you to know, I feel safe now. I feel loved. Because you never gave up on me. And you never gave up on yourself. Thank you for being my brother, my mom, my dad, and my hero." Luis sat on the floor and wept. All the pain. All the nights. All the hunger and fear and silence, it had led to this. A home. A future. A voice. 3 years after that fateful night in Riverdale, Flame House was nominated for a National Ethical Employer of the Year award. Garrett refused to accept it alone. He took Luis with him. They walked on stage side by side. Garrett gave the opening remarks but passed the microphone to Luis for the closing words. "Success isn't about how many locations you open," Luis said to a crowd of entrepreneurs. "It's about how many lives you open doors for. I was a dishwasher. And now I train leaders. Not because I changed, but because someone chose to see me." He looked out into the crowd, into the faces of suits and skeptics, managers and makers, and left them with one final truth. We all have power. The question is, do we use it to lift or to crush? To silence, or to amplify? To profit, or to protect? The applause was thunderous. Back in Riverdale, a new plaque was mounted above the kitchen door in the restaurant where it all began. It read, "To the invisible voices, you are seen. You are heard. You matter." And beside it, framed on the wall, was a faded photo of a young man in a soaked uniform, standing next to a man in a suit, both smiling through the steam. For years after that first night in the Riverdale kitchen, Luis stood once again in front of a crowd, this time, not in a restaurant, not in a corporate conference hall, not even at a government hearing. He stood in the gymnasium of a public high school in El Paso, Texas, his hometown. The bleachers were packed with teenagers. Some wore old sneakers and torn backpacks. Some were fighting the same battles Luis once did: poverty, hunger, loneliness, fear. And Luis could see it in their eyes. He recognized the slouch in their shoulders, the cautious silence, the invisible shields they wore just to make it through the day. He adjusted the mic, took a slow breath, and began. "I was one of you," he said. "I sat in a chair just like this. Same tired backpack. Same broken shoes. Same belief that my story didn't matter. But I want to tell you today, you are not invisible. He shared his journey. How life had stripped him down, how he thought silence and suffering were just the way things had to be. He told them about Sophia, about sleeping in the closet, about Garrett, about everything. And then, in the middle of the speech, something happened that Luis never expected. He choked up. He stopped speaking. The words caught in his throat. He stared down at the note cards in his hand, but they blurred under tears. He looked out at the rows of kids staring up at him, some leaning forward, holding their breath, some already wiping their eyes, and Luis let the moment happen. I used to think that if I cried, I was weak, he said, voice trembling. But now I know, these tears, they mean I survived. And if I survived, so can you. The auditorium fell into a silence so deep, it felt sacred. Then a wave of applause, deafening and real, broke through the room. Teachers stood. Students cheered. And a line formed. Kids wanting to shake his hand, tell their stories, hug someone who had made it out of the darkness. Back at home that night, Luis found Sophia sitting on the porch steps, reading a book. She was taller now. Sharper. Her hair was longer, and the glasses on her face made her look like the honors student she was becoming. She smiled when she saw him. How was the talk? She asked. Luis sat beside her and exhaled slowly, as if letting go of the weight he'd carried for years. It was good. Hard. But good. Sophia looked at him for a long second, then said softly, I'm proud of you. Luis blinked. I'm proud of you, too. They sat in silence under the stars for a while. Then Sophia turned to him. Do you ever wish it had all been easier? Luis thought about it. The years of hunger. The nights crying alone. The cold floors. The endless shifts. The fear. The betrayal. The exhaustion. The hopelessness. No, he said finally. If it had been easy, I wouldn't know what I know now. She nodded slowly, as if understanding something too big for words. Across the country, Garrett Stone was preparing to retire. The boardroom was quiet as he stood at the head of the table one last time, surrounded by the executives he had mentored over decades. He looked older now, more weathered, but there was light in his eyes. I didn't build this company to flip burgers, he began. I built it to feed families. Not just customers, but the ones behind the counters, the ones washing dishes, sweeping floors, stocking shelves. They built this company. They fed me. He paused. And one of them taught me more than any degree or business deal ever could. He pulled out a small photo and passed it around the table. It was the same framed picture from Riverdale, the one of him and Luis in the steam of that old kitchen. This is what leadership looks like, he said. This is why we do what we do. Then he placed a sealed envelope on the table. My final act as CEO, he said. Luis Alvarez is now the youngest board member in company history. The room erupted in applause. In the months that followed, Luis used his new role not just to guide the company, but to shape the world. He launched a nonprofit called Seen and Heard, focused on supporting low-wage workers through legal aid, education grants, and crisis relief. He returned to Riverdale once every month, never forgetting where it all began. He still visited Amina, the dishwasher he had helped years earlier. She was now training to become a restaurant manager and teaching English classes to immigrant workers on the weekends. One day, she pulled him aside, teary-eyed, and said, "You changed my life, Luis." Luis smiled and answered, "Someone once changed mine." The final moment of the story came not on a stage, not in a courtroom, not in a restaurant. It came years later, in a small quiet hospital room. Garrett Stone was dying. Age and illness had caught up to him. But he was peaceful. Luis sat beside his bed, holding his old mentor's hand. You were always more than a CEO, Luis whispered. Garrett smiled weakly. And you were always more than a dishwasher. They sat in silence. Then Garrett's voice, barely audible, said, "Promise me, you'll keep fighting for them." Luis nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I promise." Garrett closed his eyes for the last time, with a smile. Epilogue. Today, Luis Alvarez is a nationally known speaker, labor rights advocate, and executive board member. Seen and Heard has helped more than 50,000 workers across the U.S. reclaim stolen wages, secure housing, and access education. Sofia Alvarez is attending medical school on a full scholarship. She plans to specialize in pediatric neurology, to help children like the one she once was. And at every Flamehouse location, above every break room clock-in station, is a plaque with 5 simple words. You are seen. You matter. Final message. The story of Luis Alvarez and Garrett Stone reminds us that kindness is not weakness, and power means nothing if it isn't used to lift others. In every kitchen, in every company, in every corner of the world, there are invisible people holding everything together. All it takes is one person brave enough to look beyond the surface and say, "I see you." Because sometimes, the person washing your dishes is carrying the weight of the world. And if you look closely, you just might witness a story that changes everything.